Hello, everyone. Welcome to Changing Game Developer Life, a podcast where we interview folks working in the game industry and ask how they got there and who helped them along the way. We focus on interviewing people who may break the historical mold of who is in games.
This podcast is for anyone who's interested in the soft and squishy parts of getting into games work and how to make it better.
I'm Pejman. I'm a professor at Ontario Tech University. I teach and research game and user experience.
And I'm Jen. I'm a sociologist at the University of Waterloo's Game Institute. I mostly work with game devs and people who aspire to be game developers to understand who gets to make games as a career and why people leave it once they get there. And today our guest is Dr. Jakin Vela. You met as the executive director of the IGDA, which is the International Game Development. But he also makes games and has his own indie game company and also has an entrepreneurial side in a management consulting company. And he also has a PhD as a sociologist. So, Jacob, my first question is, how do you balance all of these? What does your day-to-day look like when you're doing all of this work?
Great question. And first of all, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here and share any tidbits of information and insight I can. But to answer your question of how I balance it all, I will be 100% real with you. I don't. And I'm so glad you asked that because the project management side of things I'm kind of like winding that down. It's funny, I started that business right before I became the executive director. And so I got a big client, and then I also became the executive director of IGDA. And I was like, oh, this is a lot of work. So I had to kind of hire a team to finalize this project, which I was still involved in. But I've pretty much winded down the project management side of things until I ramp it back up and probably let my partner or one of our contractors that worked with us kind of take over for that side of things. And then in terms of the indie game side of things, also have had to put our major project on hold just because everybody just got so busy in 2024. And the end of 2023 to 2024 has been just kind of impossible to manage realistically. So yeah, I will make no claims that I balance it all, but I do try and keep things moving, sometimes at a glacial pace, sometimes at a very fast pace, but IGDA is my main priority and focus.
Yeah, I think that's key, right? Realizing that you cannot do it all and figuring where to focus your energy on what makes you happy at this point. And I'm not sure everybody is familiar with the IGDA and what it does generally. So do you mind giving a quick intro on the mission of the IGDA and what your work for it is?
Yeah. So essentially, the IGDA, the International Game Developers Association, is the largest nonprofit, member driven professional association dedicated to game developers all around the world. And our mission is to support and empower game developers all around the world in achieving fulfilling and sustainable careers. And I like to kind of take that mission statement and break it down. I'm a big acronym person because I don't remember anything except acronyms. And the acronym I use when I talk about IGDA is GAMES, which is, obvious, right? But for that, it stands for we provide a global network of industry professionals to connect with and network with, to meet and greet with through lots of opportunities, whether that's our events, our local community chapters, our special interest groups. And I'll get into more of those in a bit. The A in GAMES stands for access. We provide access to the industry via industry discounts to particular events that you definitely want to be at if you're getting into games or if you're a developer and want to meet other developers. Industry products and software and hardware. Like if you need a new computer, we have a partnership with Dell, so we can provide discounts around the world for their products or other services like data engineering services, things of that nature. And we provide that to our members. And then the M in games stands for mentorship. So we are all about career support, career progression. And I'm a firm believer that mentorship is the cornerstone of career development, especially in marginalized communities and underrepresented communities, because having that social capital, having that person who can increase your chances of getting connected to the industry and also advancing your knowledge in a particular area is super important. And so we have an entire global mentorship program that we provide to our members, and we partner or pair you up with somebody based on whatever you're looking to do, learning more about writing in games, learning more about marketing, business, what have you. And then the E in games stands for education. We do a lot of educational and advocacy based resources and events. Most recently, we've published information like white papers, industry reports, hosted events like our Queer Indies Showcase or Women Indies Showcase to advocate for underrepresented communities in the games space. And then the S stands for solidarity, which is my favorite part. And that's all about community. We provide a community of local industry professionals and global professionals that are really situated in a particular discipline of games, such as design, engineering, production, audio, but also who share similar affinities. So we have LGBTQ plus in games, women in games, Black in games, etc. And then we also have folks who are dedicated specifically on advocacy efforts and initiatives. So folks who care about making sure people are getting proper credits in games via our game credit special interest group or our climate special interest group that focuses on increasing awareness of how to make games greener, both from a content perspective, but also from a pipeline and production perspective and approach. So yeah, so that's the IGDA in a nutshell. We do a lot, but we are a small, mighty team.
And so,
That is
what does
amazing.
your role look like as an executive director in the organization?
Oh yeah, I love that question. Sorry, you had asked like kind of what my day to day looked like also. So the role of an executive director of a nonprofit professional association will vary depending on the industry. But for the IGDA, my primary role is to remove all blocks that my team might come across. So I have a team of two full-time professionals, one who oversees our community and one who oversees our operations, like our membership, our marketing, processing things like that, the back end of stuff. And then I handle a lot of the relationship building for the organization. So I work with meeting new partners who can further our mission or who can help reach out to other members that we're not yet connected to or other community participants that we're not yet connected to as IGDA. That's also partnership building in the sense of fundraising. So, working with agencies or grant programs or studios or corporate partners who want to support the IGDA's mission in advancing and supporting game developers. I always like to be clear as an organization, we support the individual game developer. That's our main focus. But we do have some opportunities to support studios as well. In addition to partnerships and overseeing and supporting the team, I also do conflict resolution, PR, anytime we have a PR inquiry from, let's say, a games media outlet like IGN, I'll be the one to handle that or to make statements on behalf of the organization. And then to attend conferences to ensure we have a presence at particularly relevant and important industry events and industry conferences, making sure IGDA has a seat at the table, and which therefore ensures that developers around the world have a seat at the table because we're always bringing up the interest, the issues, the challenges that developers relay to our community members, which then funnel up to me.
That's really nice to hear. I can confirm the impact of IGDA on myself and my career development. And I see it on a daily basis on how much impact you have on students and especially people getting into the industry. And it's so nice to hear the mission, the way you put it forward. I really like that. I had a question. I wanted to kind of get to know you a little bit better. What is your story? How did you get to do what you are doing these days? Maybe your little bit on your background, education, projects you worked on, and until you became executive director of our main association.
Yeah. So thank you so much for sharing that with me about your connection to IGDA and how it's helped students as well. That's a very important part of IGDA for me, particularly because I'm very passionate about supporting students. And you'll know why, because I'll take you through my career. And if at any point you want to interrupt, just interrupt me and ask follow up questions, please, because I have a very windy career path to where I am today. I didn't really seek out to be where I am today. I'm a big, firm believer in that when you focus on how you want to feel, experiences you want to have, people you want to surround yourself with, and types of activities you want to be doing, things will unfold in your life to align with those if you have a very clear idea of that. I'm a firm believer in that. And so I'd have to start at the beginning when I really graduated high school and started college. I've always been a gamer my entire life. I've always, literally since I can remember, been playing games on Atari, Nintendo, Street Fighter 2, Mortal Kombat, Mario Kart, since back in the day. And when I finished high school, I actually didn't want to go to college. I wanted to move to LA and become a singer songwriter. I was willing to go out there, wait tables or bartend or whatever you have to do to make a living and follow your dream. I've always been a very passionate person of the arts. And my parents were not a fan of that. So they're like, okay, how can we get you to go to college and get some degree, because they did not have a college education. And they firmly believed that college and education were the next step into advancing your career, advancing your socioeconomic status. I came from a working class background. There were times where we had, a little extra money to spend. A lot of times we did not have any money. And so I wanted to break out of that mold through a very idealized mission to become a singer songwriter. And so they wanted me to go to college. So I went to college for film, actually, originally. And I loved it. I wanted to make films about social justice and have an impact on society, make film documentaries about the issues that people experience in the workplace. I was always very passionate about workers' rights and empowerment and getting people to band together to overcome the system that keeps people down. And this kind of plays into why I became a sociologist later. But the reason I actually became a sociologist is because I transferred to a different school to save money, but they didn't want to take my film credits. And so I got the next degree I could just to finish school, and that was a sociology degree. And it turns out that I loved it so much. It gave me the academic language to understand everything I had experienced in terms of poverty, in terms of social issues related to my identity as a gay man, related to my identity as a non religious person who grew up in a very religious household. A lot of things, sexism, misogyny, racism, all of these things that were explained to me through really the language of social stratification and sociology. And I took that and kind of ran with it into every industry thereafter. So I took that first to law. I was like, oh, this makes me want to be an attorney and fight for people's rights. And so I actually became a paralegal to kind of test the waters out. And that lasted for about 4 years. And the reason I didn't go to law school was because I looked at my future and I said, oh, this is very unsustainable in how law firms are run, how paralegals are used, how attorneys work 70, 80 hours, oftentimes turning to alcohol. And that's like a very big problem in the legal industry, at least in the US. And so I was like, let's not do that, but let's maybe turn to education because I love working with people and educating. And so I had a stint in education and career development. And that led me to helping people find the jobs that they love. That's always been a passion of mine. And then that led me back to sociology for a PhD because during the mid 2010s in the games industry, as you probably all know, there's a little thing called Gamergate that shook up the games industry. It put a spotlight onto the harassment and horrible misogyny and racism and homophobia that existed within games communities, game content, even, and in the workplace as well. And that actually pushed me to want to pursue the games industry from a sociological standpoint. I was not a programmer, an artist. I'm a musician and an audio person, but at that point, I had never worked on games or made a game aside from designing things on my own. Yeah, that led me to kind of start a study on researching minority game developers' experience, which kind of what I was doing until COVID. And then COVID hit, and that kind of ruined my research because it was all in person at GDC. So GDC stopped doing stuff in person. And I was not yet, I don't know if y'all, I mean, I'm sure y'all are probably familiar because you're academics too. What am I talking about? IRB, or in the US, we call it IRB, Institutional Review Board or Institutional Research Board. I can't actually remember which one it is, but they have to approve all your stuff. It was a very weird time for approving like online communications and recording them. So yeah, kind of ruined my research opportunity there, but I pivoted to LGBTQ experiences in game communities or LGBT guilds and MMOs. And that's what I did my dissertation on. And so from there, this I know it's like a super long story, but from there, I was working full time as a director of a cybersecurity apprenticeship because I'm, again, passionate about career development, whatever industry it is, getting people into the place they want to be. And then I saw a job opportunity open at the IGDA for a part time role. And I was like, hey, I I'm done with my PhD. I'm working full time. I have a life now. I can do a part-time gig and work with the game community that I've been doing in my own research time. And so I got that role and was the manager of global development and working with our chapters and special interest groups at IGDA, supporting them, creating resources, facilitating our mentorship program. And at that time, my boss, who was the executive director at the time, stepped away from the role to pursue another opportunity. And I was looked at to take on the interim role. And from there, I put my name in the hat for the actual permanent executive director replacement. And with my experience in nonprofit management, I totally forgot that I led a film nonprofit very similar to the IGDA a long time ago. Due to my film nonprofit, my academic research, my connection to the game developer industry, my experience with working with teams of creatives, and then also very recently having created my own studio, I believe that's why they selected me as the permanent replacement. So that was a long story of how I fell into the executive director role, but I would have never gotten the role had it not been for all of the random, I say random, but really like synchronous experiences or yeah, the very random but not so random experiences I had that led to me being where I am today.
I think that is like such a funny theme in so many of people that I talk to who are employed in the games industry, is that their path is windy and serendipitous. And at the beginning of their journey, when they were in school or starting school, they would never have been able to like guess that they would end up here today. And you've been the executive director and acting executive director for even longer, like so for more than 2 years, right?
Yeah, 2 years. I became the interim in February 2022, and then the official hire in April or May 2022. I've been acting executive director for 2 years now, a little over 2 years.
Mm-hmm. And I know when you started, you were really clear about wanting to leverage your expertise in terms of EDI, like equity, diversity, inclusion, and helping make games work a more sustainable sort of occupancy. I'm curious as to, in your sense, what's changed over the past 2 years? What's gotten better in games work? What are the challenges that you're facing now today?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I think for me, that looks a little different than I would say maybe a lot of other folks in the game space. And the reason I say that is because we are an international organization. And so anytime I use my lens of diversity, equity, and inclusion and belongingness, I also add a global aspect to that, where a lot of times I would say that the diversity discussion can often be regionally focused in a particular state or even mostly a particular country. And so I would say the great thing I've noticed is a huge emergence of new markets, new developers in regions where most people, probably when I say most people, I'm really specifically referring to folks in like the Western world, so like North America and Europe, where most people wouldn't think games are being made or game industry events are happening. So we're seeing a vibrant community burst in Latin America, across the countries of Africa and Middle East, South Asia and Southeast Asia in particular. And it's super exciting to see all of these, and it's not like they just happened overnight. I mean, they've been emerging markets for a while, some newer than others, but we're seeing government support. We're seeing connection to global industry. And so in that regard, diversity of the industry is certainly changing from a global perspective. From a more localized perspective, where I'm at, so I'm based in Dallas, Texas. So oftentimes I also take a kind of US or North American centric role if I'm talking about diversity, equity, inclusion. In that regard, sadly, the conversation's still there. The conversations are still happening, but we're not seeing a lot of actual change in the demographics of game developers. We're actually publishing our developer satisfaction survey probably next week, I think. And you'll see compared to 2019, 2021, the statistics really haven't moved. There might maybe like 1% increase in women, and then everything else is pretty much stagnant. But even that, while that 1% is great, that's still not really a significant increase that we should be expecting for an industry that has been hounded upon for not giving enough opportunities to underrepresented communities and for consistently promoting the same type of person in senior level roles and executive roles. So, in that regard, I hate to say it, but there's unfortunately not much that is changing, except now what we're seeing, at least from my perspective, in the North American context, is a much broader conversation about what worker empowerment and unionization is and how that can help some of these major goals that we have as developers, and how when workers unite their voice, they can make change happen. Maybe not all the changes that we're expecting or want, but certainly the voice being at the table is a great start. So, yeah, I would say those are kind of the two perspectives of how I've seen things change over the last 2 years in my role as the IGDA executive director. And I hope that we don't see a continuation of this Gamergate 2.0. I'm not sure if y'all have seen, but yeah, there's been talks of this Gamergate 2.0 coming out. I have personally seen an increase in harassment and negativity regarding our Queer Indie Showcase that we did, where we featured LGBTQIA plus developers and their queer games. And yeah, I think there's going to be probably another burst of hate and harassment, but this time I'm confident that our communities are going to come together and snuff that out quickly. And I haven't seen too much blow up, but hopefully it stays that way.
Thank you for that discussion. It actually makes me very happy to see someone with your perspective is leading our biggest association. And I see from the project you talked about IGDA very actively working on these initiatives. The question I had for you, as I mentioned before we start recording, we expect that maybe students, maybe some colleagues in the industry from different companies listen to this podcast. So, what sort of advice or suggestions you have for them? Basically, how can we collectively make game dev life better?
Love that question. And my first response to that is we need to give ourselves permission to be game developers. And when I say the word game developers, I really mean that as an inclusive word to anyone who's contributing to the creation, distribution, and success of a game. That can be from pre-production. Maybe you have some ideas that you're giving to folks who are taking it and running with it, to you're a marketing expert and you're helping game developers get their game to their audience and having people have these wonderful experiences that they would have not otherwise had if they didn't have good marketing and didn't know about the game. So we need to give our permission to be in this industry. And I think that stems from the fact that the industry, when it started, and I'm going to talk from this perspective in a very North American context, when this industry boomed, it was largely, a particular demographic. And to change what that industry looks like, we've seen a lot of hurdles, a lot of challenges. And because of that, I don't see an active gatekeeping of like, you can't call yourself a game developer like these days. Maybe in the early 2000s, I don't see that so much anymore. So now is the time to say, I am a game worker. I am a game developer. And we need to feel comfortable with that. And the reason I say that is because the more people we get into game development, just like any other industry, it will diversify. It will come together in that regard. But I think a lot of what holds us back is it's weird because I've been in various industries. Games is the one industry where there's this kind of weird, it's not weird, I say the word weird, but it's this intense identity connection and attachment to one's personal identity that I don't quite see as much or to the severity in other industries. So in law, I didn't quite see someone's attachment to their social life being so closely attached to being a lawyer or being a paralegal. In education, I did, but that was a very like overlapping, like you almost had no life when you worked in education or higher education because you're expected to do so much for the role that you have.
We
But
don't know what that's
outside of that,
like at all.
right. Yeah, I'm preaching to the choir here. Um, but there is still a separation between I am an educator and this is my role to I am piecing out and going to the bar with some of my colleagues and we don't want to see students or that separation. I don't see that as much in the games industry. There's a very strong attachment to one's social identity, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But what happens in my perspective is that can create a lot of tension when the demographic of what a game developer looks like changes in the public mind and in one's personal perspective of that. And so that's why I say give yourself permission to call yourself a game developer and get into the scene and do the work. I don't know if that answered the question, but that was my first thought.
It
Yeah.
did answer the question. I think fundamentally actually answered that. I really like your answer on that.
No, this is interesting because I'm picking up on a few threads here, partly in relationship to your reference to Gamergate. Do you think there are emerging pressures that the IGDA is dealing with in terms of helping developers and game studios respond to and protect themselves from player communities and online communities more generally? Because this is one of the things that I'm hearing more and more in my own interviews. And it isn't just from women developers or minority developers or anything. It is that any game developer who's making a quest in an MMO, and if they make a quest that isn't well received, they are afraid of intense and overstated retaliation from specific player communities. And this is becoming more and more a concern. Have you seen that? Am I out to lunch and thinking like,
Oh, yeah.
this seems to be new to me? And like, where is this coming from? And how do we respond?
That's such a good point, and it's something I'm actually particularly passionate about from a employee empowerment standpoint. And so I'll start with the first question that you had framed it as. Is the IGDA seeing a lot of pressure from developers and studios? Developers and studios aren't necessarily coming to us about this particular thing to say, like, how can we resolve this? But it is something that is on the radar and very closely tied to harassment campaigns. Because as you mentioned, the second someone doesn't like a particular storyline, or if a storyline is too quote unquote woke, the haters come out and they say something. And our industry's allowance of that kind of behavior to actually manipulate and change what we do internally, I believe is very closely tied to kind of what I was talking about earlier, is such an integration of game developer identity into our personal lives that even as game developers, many are gamers also. There's this also very interesting connection to our audience that we almost allow them to make choices on our career and in our career decisions and in our workplaces. But in no other industry that I can think of, and I'm happy to be wrong and someone be like, actually, this happens in this and this, but in education, I don't recall. I mean, yes, students have a voice, like that's kind of who you're serving, but I don't ever recall running into like my job decided to do this because two students complained. I'm sure that happens in law. Like my clients decided to do this, therefore we're changing our entire business model or something like that. It's very interesting. And I don't see that very much to the extent I see it in games. And I think studios emphasize the negativity without challenging it because they're scared to cause a ruckus. They're scared of harassment campaigns. We can't be scared. We have to set boundaries and say, thank you for your feedback. We hired professional designers and narrative designers to create this. I'm sorry that it didn't meet your expectations. Move on. It kind of blows my mind to let players determine our behavior, things like that. But that's a personal opinion of mine. Definitely want to iterate that is my personal approach to how I would respond to something like that. But yeah, I've seen quite a bit of an increase in that kind of behavior.
Yeah, it's interesting leaving them treating player communities as de facto experts. When you're working within a studio, you realize how intensely complex and unknowable the process is and what it looks like and the nuances of it to anybody from the outside, right?
Absolutely. And not to say that there are never communities or outspoken players that are right. Yes, there are many times where it's like, actually, yeah, your player community is kind of right about this. You should do something. But ultimately, that's a studio decision. That's a workplace decision, especially if it's related to their job. Yeah, it's very interesting.
So this leads to another line of questioning for me is how do you balance your personal perspectives and the goals of what you want the game industry to be with your official role as the executive director of the IGDA, particularly when the IGDA serves all game developers in the game industry. And that means the individual developers who are advocating for unionization and solidarity. At the same time, you're serving the interests of larger studios who, are looking for economic prosperity. What does that look like, and what tensions does that create, and how do you personally resolve that?
That is one of my favorite questions because I don't think it gets talked about enough. Going back to like the integration of identity thing, it kind of goes back to that. We as people, I believe, should have a healthy boundary between who we are as people and what we do. I've always been super career focused, and that's always been a big part of my identity. But I also have aspects of myself that don't relate to my career. And the reason I say that is because that happens quite a lot in my role. There are many times where I have to bite my tongue so much just because you're right, we serve all developers around the world. But when I say bite my tongue, it's because my default can be like I match energy. So I am always kind in my responses. I'm always kind, but there is always kind of a balance of I have to put my foot down in some instances in regards to my personal values versus what is in the best interest of the org. Thankfully, those two things, what's like my personal values and what is in the best interest of IGDA, those have not conflicted yet in a way that would make me feel uncomfortable to continue because I'm a very values driven person. If that were to ever occur, that would just not work out for me. But in terms of balancing the interest of, say, like individual developers versus studios, I always tell folks we are a member based association. Our first interest is to our members, and our membership is based primarily on that individual developer. And when there are those kind of balance issues, I'd like to say, like, how can we provide win win opportunities? Like, just because we are talking about unionization in games, yeah, not all developers are pro unionization. About 75%, according to our developer satisfaction survey, support a national union of some sort. That means a good little chunk of developers don't, or maybe don't yet know enough about unionization. Whereas for studios to balance the interest of that, I mean, it's really a sense of A, if your employees all want something, that is something you should certainly consider as a studio. But B, the, I guess, sustainable and monetary aspects of a studio don't have to be in competition with what is best for employees. And I think I've talked a lot about this in press recently, but I think what we're seeing right now is kind of the severe symptoms of capitalism showing its ugly head, and developers, I mean, it's not like we are new to this idea of capitalism, but it's impacting developers in such a way that people are thinking, what other systems and structures are there? Unionization is kind of that. How can we have a voice at the table? But then now there's other structures of co-ops, and how can we have employee-owned, community-based studios? And I think that's a really interesting turn in our current industry, and I'm curious to see how that's going to rise. But yeah, sorry, I got off a little tangent there. But yes, balancing myself and IGDA role definitely could conflict, but has not yet. And for the individual and studio balancing, I really think I'm an and person, not an or person, if that makes sense. I'm not an either or. I do not like either or thinking. As a sociologist, I think that's super limiting. And there are way more perspectives out in the world that we could be trying out that support everybody in the long run.
This is super interesting. As you were discussing, I was thinking how thoughtful and how reflective are your answer to these quite difficult questions, to be honest.
Oh, thank you.
And I'm actually very curious. I know we have a little bit of time left. I really want to know, how do you do this? Do you do like yoga? I don't know, taking journals, taking notes on your emotions? Because it's a very challenging role, and I'm learning from what you are discussing, and I'm thinking on how I would apply it in my daily job. And I'm also super curious on where is like a secret activity, is it running, I don't know, climbing,
That is
cycling.
amazing. Thank you. That is such a thoughtful question. I really appreciate it. And thank you for that. I feel like that was a very big compliment to me personally because I spent a lot of time in about, I would say from 2010 to 2014. I had a really deeply spiritual journey throughout a lot of turmoil in my life, a lot of grief, a lot of loss, specifically like loved ones who I had lost. And I did a lot of soul searching in that time. And ultimately, I learned some basic things that I think I keep with me today. The first thing I think I had mentioned actually at the very beginning of our chat today is you have to be clear about who you are, what you want. And I'm not saying I had to be clear about, I want to be the executive director in 2023 and do this. Like, no. I want to surround myself with people. And I have a book that I looked through. It's called What Color is Your Parachute? It's a career development book. I'm sure there are various opinions about it, but for me, it was a great introspective take on who do I want to surround myself with? What kind of area do I want to live in? That one I'm still working on because I love Dallas because it's home and family, but I would much rather be by a beach. What kinds of things am I good at? What kinds of things am I passionate about? What are the overlaps of those two things? Because I am great at some things that I hate doing. Those are my burnout skills. I can do them. Give me an Excel sheet of data. I can do it. I can write all of the things you need, do regression analysis, all of it. At one point in my life, sure, that was fun. Not today. No. So what am I good at? What am I passionate about? What are my values? What drives me? What wakes me up? And then having that all on a piece of paper is super enlightening. And if something doesn't fit in, is it worth it for me to be flexible to it? Or is it better for me to be rigid in my boundary and let it bounce off and let that opportunity go to someone else or let that person complain to someone else? I'm a very much about life unfolds. You co-create life, essentially. You co-create life, but you have to do your part. And then the other half can unfold in very magical and mysterious ways. I'm a scientist, but I got a lot of woo-woo in me too. I'll put it that way.
That's very nice, and it actually with that description, it makes me so happy that you accepted our invite to join this podcast.
Thank you so much. That is so
really
kind.
honored for this and for this time that you give us to have this conversation with you.
I'm curious about your paper. You have your paper of your values and who you want to surround yourself in life and what makes you passionate. What do you do when those add up to a career path that is precarious and
That
that
is so
might
good of a
not allow
question.
you to live in Dallas or your place of choice? And like how do you balance that? I'm also a first generation academic, grew up in a family that did not have money. And so following a passion was like, no, I need my bills.
Yeah, and I think that's especially important right now in such a volatile period of our industry where we have such talented game developers losing their jobs and deciding, is this industry worth it? Am I valued? Do I want to stay here? I love what I do. I'm passionate, but are the opportunities there? And so that's such an important question. And I've always taken two approaches. And it depends on how I feel on the day. My first approach, my go-to neutral state approach is if it's a non-negotiable. For example, if the career you want is a non-negotiable, you have to do it. You have to try. You might fail. But in that failure, you will learn so much and you can decide, even better informed, to try again or to do something else or to find a new way that things mix and match. Because I think a lot of people get stuck on like, oh, well, I like writing and I like creating experiences. I have to be a narrative designer. Or I like audio and I like games. I have to make music for games, but you can find that joy in so many other ways while also working and paying the bills. So that's the second approach. There's this approach on like, what shit sandwich are you willing to eat for what you're trying to do? If it's too big of a shit sandwich for you, then don't do it because it's not going to work. But if you can eat the shit sandwich and get through and do all the stuff, you're going to have some mighty tastier meals at the other end.
I love that because so much of what people when they're new to games talk about the industry as do what you love, passion, and there's no recognition that there is a shit sandwich at time that you should be expecting.
Definitely. And I'm a big believer on hope for the best, prepare for the worst. I wish I had that sense in my early 20s with finances. That would have been lovely. But for folks who are coming out of school now, don't expect the worst, but plan for it and put your energy into the best opportunities. Because, like you said, there are lots of shit sandwiches, and those shit sandwiches are very different for people. Some people who can afford to be out of a job for a year because they can live at home and they can do X, Y, or Z. Your shit sandwich is going to be very different from someone who has to start making money immediately upon graduating. Maybe they have student loans, maybe they have credit cards because that's how they survived through full-time school, working part-time jobs here and there. It's going to be different for everyone, but you have to ask yourself, is it worth it? And if it's not, it might be worth it later. You might need 2 years before it's worth it. But I'm a big firm believer, like, don't give up on your dream until you try it.
Such a nice note to end our conversation. I know in a few minutes you have your board meeting to go to. Just wanted to say thank you again for joining us. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Likewise.
I learned a lot from your comments and your thoughtful responses, and I'm sure that our listener also find this super useful.
I hope so. And anyone can contact me if they're interested in learning more about the IGDA or getting involved with the community. I'm like an open door. It might take a while because my schedule is a little wonky, but I have an open door policy to folks who want to reach out and connect.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Vela.
Thank you so much for having me.
You can check out our website at www.changinggamedevlife.com for summary notes, a full transcript, and related resources that are mentioned in this episode. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to our Substack page or follow us on your favorite podcast platform so you never miss an episode. We're very passionate about having these conversations with people who make the game industry better. Together, we can drive positive changes. If this episode resonated with you, make sure to share the podcast with your network and take a moment to rate us on whatever platform you use. Thank you.